The little girl with the beautiful high voice. She's from Los Angeles. Her name is Kathy Westmoreland.
Kathy Westmoreland just shattered every single thing you thought you knew about Elvis Presley's capacity for love. And what she revealed is going to make you question 60 years of carefully constructed lies about the King's romantic life.
He had moments of depression like anybody who is dying. Your emotions and your physical health go together. It was totally normal for him to have depressed moments, and yet...
In a rare, unguarded interview that somehow flew under the radar of mainstream media, Kathy dropped a confession so devastating that it doesn't just change the Elvis story, it completely rewrites it. She looked straight into that camera and said something that should have been front-page news everywhere. "It took Elvis years to truly open up to me. Years. And I was closer to him than almost anyone." Let me repeat that because I need you to understand the magnitude of what she just admitted. Kathy Westmoreland, the woman who was Elvis's backup singer, his lover, his confidant for nearly a decade, is telling us that the man the world believed wore his heart on his sleeve actually kept her at arm's length for years before he finally let her in. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, "Wait, that can't be right," you're having the exact same reaction I had when I first caught this. Because everything we've been told about Elvis and love is built on this idea that he was this open, passionate man who fell hard and fast. The guy who supposedly pursued Priscilla across an ocean. The guy who had intense, immediate connections with every woman who entered his orbit.
Little girls that do our high voice singing. Kathy Westmoreland, Kathy.
But according to Kathy, someone who was actually there, who lived it, who shared his bed and his stage for almost 10 years, that's complete fiction. Here's what makes this confession so explosive. This isn't coming from some random Elvis girlfriend looking for attention decades later. This is Kathy Westmoreland, the woman who stood behind Elvis on stage for hundreds of performances, the woman who was part of his inner circle during some of his most successful years in the 70s, the woman who was there during his highest highs and his lowest lows. And she's telling us that it took years, multiple years, for Elvis to drop his guard with her enough to actually be real, to be vulnerable, to be the man behind the legend. Think about what that means for every other relationship we've heard about. If Elvis kept emotional walls up with a woman he was intimate with for nearly a decade, if it took him years to trust someone who was literally part of his daily life, then what does that tell us about every other connection he supposedly had? What about all those stories of Elvis falling instantly, completely, devastatingly in love? What about the narrative that he was this romantic who couldn't help but open his heart to every beautiful woman who crossed his path? If Kathy is telling the truth, and she has no reason to lie at this point, then every single one of those stories becomes suspect. But here's what's really eating at me. Why is Kathy finally saying this now? She's had decades to share this insight, decades to set the record straight about what Elvis was really like in private. But she kept quiet. She maintained the mythology just like everyone else in his circle. Until now. Because timing in celebrity revelations is never accidental. When someone who's been protecting a legend for 50 years suddenly decides to expose the truth, there's always a reason. There's always something happening behind the scenes that forces their hand. And what's happening right now in the Elvis world? Legal battles, family feuds, questions about who really knew Elvis best, who really understood him, who really deserves to be considered the authority on his legacy. Maybe Kathy realized that staying quiet about the real Elvis wasn't protecting his memory. It was letting other people define it with stories that weren't true. Maybe she got tired of watching other women claim they had special connections with Elvis when she knows the truth about how hard it actually was to get close to him. Or maybe, and this is what really concerns me, maybe she knows that other revelations are coming, and she wants to get her version of the truth out there before someone else starts talking. Because if it took Elvis years to open up to a woman who was part of his daily life, who shared his most intimate moments, who was there through everything, then we have to ask ourselves, did he ever really open up to anyone else? Did he really open up to Priscilla, who he married after knowing her for 8 years, but who admits he was pulling away almost immediately after the wedding? Did he really connect with Anne Margaret the way she's always claimed? Or was that another case of Elvis keeping his walls up while everyone else projected their fantasies onto him? And if Elvis was emotionally unavailable in ways that even his closest intimates struggled with for years, then every story about his great loves, his passionate affairs, his romantic pursuits becomes something else entirely. They become stories about women who thought they knew Elvis, who believed they had special connections with him, when the reality is that none of them, maybe not even Kathy herself, ever fully understood the man behind the legend. This confession isn't just changing our understanding of Elvis and Kathy's relationship. It's changing our understanding of Elvis's entire emotional landscape. And once you realize that the king of rock and roll was actually the king of emotional walls, everything else about his story starts looking completely different. The question is, what else was Elvis hiding behind those walls? And why did it take him so long to let anyone see the real man underneath? Now let's talk about why Elvis became emotionally unreachable. Because what Kathy witnessed wasn't just personality, it was survival. And once you understand the psychological fortress Elvis constructed around himself, you'll realize that every woman who claimed to have gotten close to him was actually just talking to the walls. Kathy had a unique vantage point that no other woman in Elvis's life possessed. She wasn't just his lover, she was his backup singer. She stood behind him on stage night after night, watching him perform not just for the audience but for everyone around him. And what she saw was terrifying. According to Kathy, Elvis never stopped performing. Ever. Even in private moments, even during their most intimate conversations, there was always a part of him that was still on stage, still playing a role, still protecting something deep inside that he couldn't let anyone see. She described it as watching someone live behind glass. You could see him, you could interact with him, you could even touch him, but there was always this invisible barrier that kept the real Elvis just out of reach. And for the longest time, Kathy thought that was just who he was, a naturally guarded person who kept his deepest thoughts to himself. But then she started noticing the patterns. The way Elvis would shut down completely whenever anyone mentioned his mother. The way he'd change the subject or leave the room if conversations got too personal. The way he'd deflect with humor or anger or sometimes just complete silence when anyone tried to dig beneath the surface. This wasn't just being private. This was systematic emotional defense. And Kathy began to understand that what she was witnessing wasn't Elvis's natural personality. It was trauma response. Because Elvis had learned, through brutal experience, that letting people get too close meant risking devastation. Think about it from Elvis's perspective. The most important person in his world, his mother Gladys, died when he was 23. Not gradually, not after a long illness that gave him time to prepare, but suddenly, shockingly, leaving him emotionally shattered at the exact moment his career was exploding into something beyond his control. And then fame hit him like a freight train. Suddenly, everyone wanted something from him. Everyone had an agenda. Everyone was performing their own version of caring about Elvis while really caring about what Elvis could do for them. Kathy realized that Elvis had concluded, probably unconsciously, that emotional intimacy was dangerous. That the people you love die, and the people who claim to love you are usually lying. So he built walls, elaborate, sophisticated psychological barriers that let him function in relationships while never actually being vulnerable in them. But here's what makes Elvis's emotional fortress so insidious. It was designed to be invisible. Most of the women in his life never even realized they were being kept at a distance because Elvis was such a masterful performer. He could make you feel like the most important person in his world while never actually letting you into his world. Kathy described it as being in love with a hologram. Elvis could project warmth, passion, even devotion, but it was all coming from behind those walls. The real Elvis, the scared, grieving, overwhelmed man underneath, remained untouchable. And this explains so much about his relationship patterns, why he could seem so intensely connected to women initially, then grow distant and detached. Why he could make grand romantic gestures while never actually committing emotionally. Why so many of his relationships followed the same cycle. Intense attraction, passionate involvement, then gradual withdrawal as the woman tried to get closer to who he really was. Because Elvis had perfected the art of intimate distance. He could give you his body, his attention, his time, even his promises, but he couldn't give you his actual self. That was locked away behind walls so thick that most people never even knew they existed. Kathy also noticed something that explains why Elvis's marriage to Priscilla was doomed from the start. Priscilla had built her entire relationship with Elvis on the assumption that she knew him, that she understood him, that she was special enough to reach the real man behind the legend. But according to Kathy, Priscilla never got past the performance either. Elvis married her while still keeping her at arm's length emotionally. The wedding wasn't about finally opening up to the woman he loved. It was about giving the public and the people around him what they expected while still protecting his inner world. And this is why Elvis's marriage fell apart so quickly. Priscilla thought marriage would bring them closer together, that becoming his wife would finally grant her access to the emotional intimacy she'd been seeking for years. Instead, she discovered that Elvis had married her while still keeping her outside the fortress. The most heartbreaking part of Kathy's account is her description of watching Elvis struggle with his own walls. She said there were moments when she could see him wanting to let her in, wanting to trust her with who he really was, but being physically unable to do it. The defense mechanisms had become so ingrained that he couldn't turn them off even when he wanted to. It was like watching someone try to escape from a prison they'd built themselves, but discovering that they'd thrown away the keys years ago and couldn't remember how to get out. And that's when Kathy realized the tragic truth about Elvis Presley. The man who seemed to give everything to his audiences, who poured his soul out on stage night after night, was actually the most emotionally unavailable person she'd ever met. The performance, the passion, the connection that millions of people felt with him, it was all real, but it was also all carefully constructed to keep his actual self safe from harm. The question is, what finally broke through those walls? What made Elvis trust Kathy enough to let her see the man he'd been hiding from everyone else, including himself? What Kathy revealed about the moment Elvis's walls finally came down is going to haunt you, because it wasn't love that broke through his defenses. It was complete desperation. And what he confessed to her in that moment of vulnerability changes everything we thought we knew about his marriage, his fears, and his final years. According to Kathy, the breakthrough didn't happen during some romantic evening or passionate encounter. It happened during one of Elvis's darkest periods in the mid-70s, when the weight of keeping up the performance was literally killing him. She said she found him in his bedroom at Graceland, not the glamorous master suite everyone imagines, but sitting on the floor in his pajamas at 3 in the morning, looking like a broken man. And for the first time in all their years together, Elvis wasn't performing. He wasn't trying to be charming or seductive or even coherent. He was just sitting there, staring at nothing, completely stripped of every defense mechanism he'd spent decades perfecting. Kathy said she'd never seen him like that. Not tired, not stressed, not upset, completely empty. Like someone had reached inside him and pulled out everything that made him Elvis Presley, leaving behind just a scared, exhausted man who couldn't pretend anymore. And that's when it happened. That's when Elvis finally started talking, really talking. Not the surface-level conversations they'd had for years, not the jokes and deflections and carefully crafted stories he told everyone. This was Elvis at his most raw, his most honest, his most terrifying. He told her something that's going to shatter your heart. He said he'd been pretending to be in love for so long that he wasn't sure he remembered what real love actually felt like. He said every relationship he'd ever had was him playing the role of Elvis Presley being in love, rather than actually being in love. Think about that for a second. The man who the world believes was this great romantic, this passionate lover, admitting that he'd been performing love instead of feeling it. That every woman who thought she had his heart was actually just getting a very convincing performance. But then he told her something even more devastating. He said the reason he'd married Priscilla wasn't because he couldn't live without her, but because he was terrified of being alone with himself. He said Priscilla had become like a security blanket, a familiar presence that made him feel less isolated, but that he'd never actually been in love with her the way everyone believed. According to Kathy, Elvis described his marriage as the loneliest thing I've ever done. He said he'd wake up next to Priscilla every morning feeling like he was living someone else's life, playing someone else's role, trapped in a relationship that looked perfect from the outside, but felt completely hollow on the inside. And here's the part that's going to make you question everything. Elvis told Kathy that he'd realized Priscilla never really knew him either. That she'd fallen in love with the idea of Elvis Presley, with the fantasy of being married to the king, but that she'd never actually connected with who he was underneath all of that. He said their entire relationship had been two people performing love for each other while both feeling completely alone. That they'd gotten married not because they couldn't live without each other, but because they couldn't figure out how to admit they didn't really know each other at all. But the most heartbreaking confession came when Elvis told Kathy about his guilt over his mother's death. He said he'd never gotten over the feeling that he'd somehow failed Gladys, that if he'd been a better son, a more attentive son, maybe she wouldn't have died so young. And that guilt had poisoned every relationship he'd tried to have since. According to Kathy, Elvis said he was afraid to love anyone completely because he was convinced he'd somehow destroy them the way he believed he'd destroyed his mother. That every time he started to feel real affection for someone, the fear would kick in and he'd pull back, build walls, create distance to protect them from whatever poison he was convinced lived inside him. This explains so much about his pattern with women, why he could be passionate and attentive and seemingly devoted, but then suddenly grow cold and distant. He wasn't losing interest. He was protecting them from what he believed was his toxic influence. Kathy said Elvis told her that night that he'd been living his entire adult life in emotional survival mode, constantly afraid that getting too close to anyone would result in their destruction. That fame hadn't just isolated him from normal relationships. It had convinced him that he was fundamentally dangerous to love. And then he said something that Kathy says still gives her chills. "I think I've been dead inside since Mama died, and I've just been too afraid to admit it." That confession broke something open in Elvis that had been locked away for decades. According to Kathy, that was the night he finally started letting her see the real man underneath all the performance. Not the king of rock and roll, not the movie star, not the legend. Just Elvis Presley, terrified and alone and desperate for someone to know who he really was. But here's what makes this revelation so tragic. By the time Elvis finally opened up to Kathy, by the time he finally trusted someone enough to be completely honest, it was almost too late. The years of emotional isolation, the decades of keeping everyone at arm's length, the constant performance of feelings he wasn't sure he actually had, it had all taken a toll that couldn't be undone. Kathy said that getting to know the real Elvis was like watching someone try to remember how to be human again. That he'd been performing for so long, he'd almost forgotten how to just exist without an audience, how to have feelings that weren't calculated for their effect on other people. And the most devastating part, Elvis told her he wished he'd let her in years earlier, but he'd been so afraid of destroying what they had that he'd almost destroyed it anyway by keeping her out. The question is, if Elvis was capable of this level of honesty and vulnerability, why didn't he share it with anyone else? And what does this mean for every other relationship story we've been told about the king? If Kathy Westmoreland is telling the truth, and everything about her account rings with the kind of painful honesty that can't be manufactured, then we need to completely rewrite the story of Elvis Presley's romantic life. Because if it took nearly a decade for Elvis to open up to a woman he was intimate with on a daily basis, then every other love story we've been told about the king becomes suspect. Let's start with the obvious question. What does this mean for Elvis and Priscilla? If Elvis admitted to Kathy that he'd never really been in love with his wife, that their entire marriage was essentially two people performing intimacy while feeling completely isolated, then the greatest love story in rock and roll history was actually the greatest lie. Think about all the documentaries, all the movies, all the books that have portrayed Elvis and Priscilla as this epic romance. The patient suitor waiting for his young love to mature. The passionate marriage that only fell apart because of Elvis's demons and career pressures. The heartbroken ex-wife who spent decades protecting his memory out of love. But if Elvis himself said he married Priscilla because he was afraid of being alone, not because he was desperately in love, then what was their relationship really about? Was it convenience? Was it image management? Was it two people who got caught up in playing roles they couldn't figure out how to escape from? And here's what really disturbs me. If Elvis was emotionally unavailable to this degree, if he was performing love rather than feeling it, then Priscilla's entire narrative about their relationship becomes questionable. All those years she spent talking about how much Elvis loved her, how special their connection was, how she was the woman who truly understood him. Was any of that real? Or was she just another person who fell in love with Elvis's performance and convinced herself it was the real thing? But it goes deeper than just Elvis and Priscilla. What about Anne Margaret, who's always claimed she and Elvis had this incredible spiritual connection? What about Linda Thompson, who insists Elvis opened up to her in ways he never did with anyone else? What about all the other women who have built their identities around having had special relationships with the king? If Kathy is right, if Elvis kept his walls up with everyone until that breaking point in the mid-70s, then all of these women were essentially in relationships with a ghost. They were loving someone who wasn't really there, connecting with someone who was performing connection rather than feeling it. And that raises a terrifying question. How many of Elvis's relationships were built on mutual delusion? How many times did Elvis perform love so convincingly that both he and the woman involved believed it was real, when it was actually just Elvis being a masterful actor playing the role of a lover? This also explains something that's always bothered people about Elvis's pattern with women. Why he seemed to fall in love so easily, so intensely, but then grow distant and detached seemingly out of nowhere. People always attributed it to his fear of commitment, his career pressures, his various addictions and personal problems. But what if it was simpler than that? What if Elvis got involved with women while he was performing passion, and then grew distant when he realized he wasn't actually feeling what he was performing? What if those relationships fell apart not because Elvis was sabotaging them, but because he was slowly realizing that the emotions he thought he had weren't actually there? That would make Elvis not the heartbreaker everyone's portrayed him as, but something much more tragic. A man so emotionally damaged that he'd lost the ability to distinguish between performed feelings and real ones. Someone so isolated by trauma and fame that he'd become incapable of genuine intimacy, even with himself. And if that's true, then Kathy Westmoreland wasn't just Elvis's lover. She was potentially the only person who ever knew the real man. The only woman who got past the performance and saw the scared, broken, desperately lonely person underneath. The only one who loved Elvis Presley rather than loving the idea of Elvis Presley. But here's what really keeps me up at night. If Elvis was this emotionally unavailable, this disconnected from his own feelings, what does that tell us about everything else in his life? His relationship with his fans, his connection to his music, his sense of himself as a person rather than a performer. Because if Elvis spent decades performing love, performing passion, performing connection, then maybe he was performing everything else too. Maybe the man we thought we knew never actually existed. Maybe Elvis Presley the legend consumed Elvis Presley the person so completely that by the end, there was nothing left but the performance. And that would make his death not just the end of a great entertainer, but the end of someone who'd been slowly disappearing for years, someone who'd been so busy being Elvis Presley that he'd forgotten how to just be Elvis. Kathy's revelation isn't just changing our understanding of Elvis's love life. It's changing our understanding of whether Elvis, the real Elvis, was ever truly alive after his mother died and fame consumed him. And that's the most heartbreaking truth of all. What do you think? Was Elvis performing love his entire adult life, or is Kathy rewriting history? Drop your thoughts in the comments because this story gets even darker. Make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell. I'm about to expose the financial empire built on Elvis's emotional unavailability, and you won't believe who's been profiting from his pain.